The sun rose over the sprawling Lancaster estate, casting golden hues across the manicured gardens. White silk ribbons adorned the ancient oak trees, their knots fluttering in the morning breeze. It was a day of celebration, a day when two families would unite in love and tradition. Guests arrived in droves, their laughter and chatter filling the air, unaware that by nightfall, the estate would bear witness to something far beyond the realm of joy or matrimony. The Lancaster wedding was set to be the event of the year. Annabel Lancaster, the beloved youngest daughter of the prestigious family, was marrying Daniel Whitmore, heir to an old banking dynasty. The union of the two families was spoken of in newspapers and whispered about in social circles, a spectacle of wealth, heritage, and romance. Every detail had been meticulously planned. Every flower, every plate, every note of music carefully selected to craft a picture-perfect day. Yet, beneath the extravagance, an undercurrent of unease slithered unnoticed. Annabel stood in her dressing room, her lace veil draped over a vintage full-length mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something about it felt off. A strange, almost imperceptible delay in her own movements, as if the mirror was considering whether to obey. She dismissed the thought, chalking it up to nerves. Weddings were overwhelming, after all. Downstairs, the groom and his groomsmen shared a celebratory drink in the grand hall, their laughter echoing off the mahogany walls. Daniel was the embodiment of confidence, but his best man, Christopher, noticed his occasional glances toward the old painting that hung above the fireplace. It was an oil portrait of the first Lancaster bride, a woman whose name had been lost to time, but whose legend endured. She died on her wedding night, Christopher mused, swirling his whiskey. Heart failure, they say. Strange for someone so young. Daniel chuckled, shaking off the chill that had crept into his spine. Outside, guests gathered beneath the rose-laden archway, awaiting the procession. The air smelled of lilies and damp earth, an oddly funereal combination. An elderly aunt, seated in the front row, leaned toward her sister and whispered, "This house has always felt haunted, hasn't it? Even in the daylight." The other woman scoffed, dismissing the notion with a wave of her hand. Yet, the feeling lingered, as though the walls themselves were listening. The ceremony was set to begin at noon, but as the hour approached, a cloud passed over the sun, casting an eerie shadow over the estate. The officiant, Father Wallace, cleared his throat and adjusted his ceremonial robes, his fingers lingering on the aged leather of his prayer book. He had conducted many weddings, but none in a place that felt so watched. He shook off his apprehension, reminding himself that fear had no place in sacred unions. The wedding planner paced frantically inside the reception hall, checking that everything was in order. The cake, a towering white confection adorned with delicate sugar flowers, had been delivered an hour ago. But when she glanced at it now, she froze. One of the sugar flowers had crumbled to dust, leaving behind a faint, reddish stain on the pristine white icing. Annabel's mother, Eleanor Lancaster, smoothed the folds of her champagne-colored gown, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. She had hosted countless events in the estate, but today, she could not shake the sense of something being wrong. It was not the typical nerves of a wedding day. It was something deeper, something primal, a whispering instinct that urged her to take her daughter and leave before the vows were exchanged. As the music began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony, a hush fell over the crowd. The doors to the manor creaked open, and Annabel stepped forward, a vision of perfection in white lace. The guests rose to their feet, smiles on their faces. But somewhere, in the back of the crowd, an unfamiliar figure stood completely still, watching, waiting. No one had seen them arrive. No one knew their name. And yet, they were there, silent, unmoving. Annabel took her first step down the aisle, her father's arm linked with hers. The music swelled, the flowers swayed, the air thickened. The perfect day had begun, but before it could end, something unspeakable would unfold. The air inside the Lancaster estate had taken on an almost imperceptible weight, a thickness that clung to the skin like humidity before a storm. The wedding guests, oblivious to the shift, remained enraptured by the spectacle of Annabelle's slow, graceful walk down the aisle. Each step was measured, rehearsed to perfection, and yet, beneath the cathedral veil, her expression was unreadable. A flicker of doubt crossed her features, so brief it was almost imagined. As she approached the altar, Daniel extended his hand, his smile bright and reassuring. She hesitated just for a moment before placing her gloved fingers in his. A whisper of unease coiled in her stomach, but there was no turning back. The vows would be exchanged, and everything would be as it should be. Or so she told herself. Father Wallace opened his prayer book, the pages crackling like brittle leaves. He began the ceremony in a solemn, practiced voice, but there was something odd about his words, an almost imperceptible slur, as if his tongue had suddenly grown heavy. He blinked, shook his head slightly, and continued, though a single bead of sweat had formed at his temple. From the front row, Eleanor Lancaster watched with narrowed eyes, her fingers digging into the satin of her gown. In the audience, an old woman clutched at her pearls, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. To her left, a young boy squirmed in his seat, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ceremony. "Who's the lady in the black dress?" His mother glanced around in confusion. There was no woman in black. The child's lip quivered. "She's standing right behind the bride." The chandeliers overhead flickered, just once, like a slow blink, before the light steadied. The disruption was so brief that most didn't notice, but a few guests exchanged uneasy glances. At the altar, Annabelle's grip on Daniel's hand tightened. She wasn't sure why, but a sensation like ice water trickled down her spine. Father Wallace's voice faltered mid-sentence. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the next page of his book. It was supposed to contain the vows, the sacred words he had spoken 100 times before. But the text was gone. The pages were blank. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become. A gust of wind rushed through the open doors of the estate, though the air outside had been still just moments before. The candles that lined the aisle flickered violently, their flames bending as though exhaling a final breath. A murmur rippled through the guests. It was a small thing, an unnatural draft, a moment of silence, but it carried the weight of something deeper, something old. Daniel shifted uneasily, his eyes scanning the crowd. And then he saw it, the figure standing at the very back, where the light didn't quite reach. It wasn't one of the guests. It wasn't a servant. It wasn't anything he could explain. The shape was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Just an outline, a presence. And though it had no face, Daniel knew it was staring directly at him. Annabelle turned to follow his gaze, but as soon as she did, the figure was gone. The unease in her stomach twisted into something sharper. She looked back at Daniel, expecting reassurance, but his face had gone pale, his breathing shallow. "Daniel," she whispered, barely moving her lips. The silence stretched too long. The moment lingered too heavy. And then, as if snapping back into reality, Father Wallace forced a tight smile and continued, though his voice wavered slightly. "Do you, Annabelle Lancaster, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Annabelle wet her lips, inhaled deeply, and opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, the old wooden doors at the back of the estate slammed shut with a force that rattled the very foundation of the house. The chandeliers flickered again, longer this time. The room dimmed, and somewhere, just beneath the hum of nervous whispers, came the unmistakable sound of laughter. But no one had laughed. For a brief moment, time stood still. The great hall, filled with the scent of white roses and aged wood, now held its breath. The doors at the back of the estate had slammed shut with such force that a few guests jumped in their seats. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd, a collective attempt to dismiss what had just happened as an unfortunate draft. But there had been no wind, only the weight of something unseen pressing against the room. Annabelle's fingers twitched against Daniel's, her grip tightening ever so slightly. She could feel it, though she dared not say it aloud. A presence, a whisper of something just beyond her comprehension. The silence that followed the slamming doors was unnatural, stretched thin like an old violin string about to snap. Father Wallace, visibly shaken but determined to maintain composure, cleared his throat and forced a smile. I believe we can continue." He turned to Annabelle once more. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Annabelle hesitated. It was only for a second, but in that second, the air seemed to thicken, as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for her answer. She swallowed hard and parted her lips. "I do." The words barely escaped her mouth before the sound came again. A laugh. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so faint that no one seemed to react to it. No one but Annabelle and Daniel. The laughter slithered through the air, neither male nor female, neither childlike nor elderly. It was a sound that should not have existed. Daniel's spine stiffened, his pulse hammering in his ears. He searched the room, looking for the source, but there was no one out of place. No stranger, no intruder. Yet, he knew someone had laughed. Annabelle felt her breath hitch. The laughter was inside her head now, slipping between her thoughts, curling around her memories like smoke. It faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only its echo, a lingering chill in the pit of her stomach. She turned to Father Wallace, hoping for some reassurance, but the priest's face was ashen. He heard it too. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words felt heavy, almost reluctant, as if they carried a weight beyond their meaning. Daniel swallowed hard, turned to Annabelle, and lifted her veil. Her face was pale, her eyes uncertain, but she managed a small smile. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss that should have sealed their love, their future, their forever. But the moment their lips met, the grand chandelier overhead let out a slow, groaning creak. The guests gasped as the massive crystal structure, which had hung undisturbed for over a century, began to sway, first gently, then with growing intensity. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the room, an awful screech that clawed at the ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. A hush fell over the hall. No one dared move. The chandelier, which had moments ago threatened to collapse, now hung perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. An old woman in the second row clutched her chest, her breath ragged. "It's an omen," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a warning." Daniel turned to Annabelle, his pulse still hammering. He had never believed in ghosts, never put stock in superstitions. But as he looked into his new wife's eyes, he knew with an unsettling certainty they were not alone in this house. The reception hall at Lancaster Estate was bathed in a warm, golden glow. The long banquet tables, draped in white linen and adorned with flickering candles, stretched across the grand room, lined with guests eager to celebrate the newlyweds. Crystal glasses clinked as the first round of champagne was poured, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. To an outsider, it was the perfect wedding reception, elegant, traditional, and full of joy. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Annabelle sat beside Daniel at the head table, smiling when expected, nodding at passing guests, but inside, she felt hollow. The kiss at the altar, the swaying chandelier, these were small things, easily explained away. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them from the ceremony, something unseen but watching. Across the hall, Eleanor Lancaster, Daniel's mother, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity. Her posture was rigid, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass in slow, deliberate circles. She had been raised in this house, had spent her childhood roaming its halls, and she knew when it didn't feel right. Tonight, the house was different. The air was thick with something old, something that had awoken. Father Wallace sat stiffly near the far end of the table, staring at his untouched plate. He had yet to speak to anyone since the ceremony. The blank pages in his prayer book still haunted him, though he dared not mention them. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted his glass, as if the weight of the night had settled into his very bones. Then came the first toast. Daniel's best man, Charles Whitmore, a childhood friend, stood with a grin and raised his glass high. To Daniel and Annabelle, He began, his voice strong and confident. "May your love be as timeless as this estate, and may your marriage be filled with." The lights flickered. A soft, barely noticeable pulse of darkness washed over the room, just long enough to make people pause. Then, just as quickly, the chandeliers blazed back to life, casting long, uneasy shadows against the walls. A murmur ran through the guests, a few nervous laughs breaking the tension. Charles hesitated, then chuckled. "Guess the house approves?" Polite laughter followed, but Annabelle wasn't amused. She turned to Daniel, expecting reassurance, but he was already looking past her, his gaze fixed on the far end of the hall. A figure stood near the entrance, barely visible in the dim light. At first, Annabelle thought it was a shadow, a trick of the flickering candles, but no, the shape was too defined, too present. It was a woman. She stood still, her face obscured by the low lighting, but Annabelle could make out the unmistakable detail of her gown. Black. A cold, creeping unease slithered up Annabelle's spine. The guests around them continued chatting, toasting, oblivious. No one else had noticed her. Daniel leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see her?" Annabelle gave a small nod, and then the woman moved, not like a normal person, not a step forward, not a graceful glide. It was as if the room itself shifted around her, bending the space between them, closing the distance in a way that made Annabelle's stomach churn. Daniel pushed back from the table, his breath shallow. But the moment he blinked, she was gone. The air around them felt heavier, thicker, like the walls of the estate were closing in. Annabelle swallowed hard, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. The glass was cold, too cold, like it had just been pulled from a frozen grave. Charles, oblivious to the tension now gripping the newlyweds, lifted his glass once more. "To the Lancasters," he said with a grin. But before he could drink, the crystal goblet in his hand shattered, the sharp crack cutting through the air like a gunshot. Wine splattered across the tablecloth like fresh blood. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of shattering crystal still echoed faintly in the grand hall, as if the very walls of Lancaster Estate were holding on to it, unwilling to let it fade. Charles stood frozen, staring at his trembling hand, now slick with dark red liquid. At first, he thought it was just the wine, but then he saw the thin, glistening lines of blood weaving between his fingers. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. The table closest to Charles shifted back, chairs scraping against the hardwood floor. Annabelle's breath hitched as she saw tiny, sharp fragments of glass embedded in Charles's palm. The injury wasn't deep, but it was unnatural. A glass doesn't simply explode from a toast. Daniel was on his feet in an instant. "Are you all right?" His voice was steady, but Annabelle could hear the tension behind it. Charles let out a nervous chuckle, shaking off the shock. "Yeah, just a freak accident, I guess." He grabbed a napkin and dabbed at his palm, though Annabelle noticed how his eyes flickered toward the chandelier, as if wondering if it had something to do with this. Servants rushed over to clean the mess, but the energy in the room had changed. The celebration had soured, the laughter subdued. No one wanted to say it aloud, but everyone felt the same thing. Something was wrong with this wedding. Eleanor Lancaster, who had been watching the entire event unfold with an unreadable expression, stood from her seat at the far end of the table. "Perhaps it's time for a little fresh air," she suggested, her voice smooth but firm. "The garden is lovely this time of night." It was a distraction. Annabelle knew it, Daniel knew it, but it worked. Guests began murmuring in agreement, some even smiling, as if stepping outside could erase the unease that had seeped into the house. Annabelle stood, ready to move, but then a whisper. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a voice just beneath the threshold of hearing. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a language. It was pure sound, something ancient, something forgotten. It slithered against her ear like a cold breath, vanishing before she could react. She turned to Daniel, but the look in his eyes told her he had heard it too. The doors to the garden were thrown open, and the night air rushed in, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and roses. Guests poured out onto the grand terrace, relieved to escape the oppressive air of the reception hall. The stars above were dim, their light swallowed by thick clouds rolling in from the east. Annabelle followed Daniel outside, her pulse still racing. The fresh air did little to ease the sensation pressing against her chest. She turned back toward the estate and found herself staring at the tall windows of the grand hall. And that's when she saw her again, the woman in black. She was standing just beyond the glass, inside the house, her face still obscured by darkness. But this time, Annabelle could feel her gaze, burning, pressing into her. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the woman raised her hand and knocked against the glass. It was impossibly loud boom, boom, boom. The entire house shuddered with the force of it. Guests turned back, startled. A few let out gasps. But as soon as Annabelle blinked, the woman was gone. The only thing left was the echo of her knock, reverberating deep within the bones of Lancaster Estate. The guests stood frozen on the terrace, their gazes flickering between one another, silently questioning whether anyone else had heard the deafening knocks. The chill of the night air did little to cool the sudden heat in Annabelle's chest. She felt as though something inside the estate had shifted, like the house itself had taken a slow, deliberate breath. Daniel turned to her, his face pale under the dim glow of the lanterns. "Did you see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Annabelle nodded, unable to form words. The woman in black was real, or at least real enough to leave her presence behind. The worst part wasn't the knocking, nor the way the house seemed to react to it. It was the sense that the woman had not left. The guests, eager to push past their discomfort, began murmuring reassurances. "Old houses creak," one man muttered. "Could have been a strong wind," a woman suggested. Someone even laughed nervously, raising a glass as if to toast away the unease. Eleanor Lancaster did not offer reassurances. She stood by the railing, watching the estate with a knowing expression, her wine glass untouched. She had grown up here, after all. She knew better. Father Wallace, who had been uncharacteristically silent the entire evening, finally spoke. "It would be wise," he said, his voice steady but firm, "for no one to go back inside alone." A hush fell over the guests. His words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they felt like a warning. Charles, still nursing his bandaged hand, gave an awkward chuckle. "All right, Father, let's not scare the bride and groom on their big day." But even as he said it, he rubbed his injured palm absent-mindedly, his fingers tracing over the dried blood beneath the gauze. Daniel forced a smile. "We've all had a bit too much excitement for one evening. Why don't we?" A thunderous crash from inside the estate cut him off. The sound was massive, like a chandelier dropping from the ceiling, or a bookshelf toppling over. It sent vibrations through the ground beneath them, rattling the delicate glasses on the terrace tables. Several guests screamed. Others turned in frantic confusion. Annabelle grabbed Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Then silence. No movement. No cries for help. No scrambling footsteps from inside the house. Just pure, unbroken silence. Annabelle's heart pounded against her ribs. She could feel the weight of the moments settling over them, as though the house was waiting, expecting someone to step forward. Eleanor finally exhaled, slow and measured. "I will go." "No," Daniel said quickly. "We'll all go." He turned to the guests, his expression caught between nervousness and authority. "No one leaves the group. We move together." And so they did, like mourners approaching an open grave. They stepped back in a Lancaster estate, the warmth of the house feeling heavier than before. The grand hall, once filled with music and laughter, was now a tomb of shadows. And at the center of it all, beneath the grand chandelier, stood an overturned chair, the only sign that something had changed. Something had been here, and it had left its mark. The overturned chair stood in the center of the grand hall like a deliberate statement. It was positioned exactly where Charles had been sitting before his glass shattered, its legs pointing skyward like the limbs of something lifeless. The guests hesitated in the doorway, reluctant to cross the threshold. It was not just a chair, it was a sign. Annabelle shivered. The house was no longer just a setting for a celebration. It had become a thing that breathed, its wooden floors groaning under the weight of the past. The air inside was wrong, as if it had been disturbed by something unseen, something watching. Eleanor Lancaster stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. She tilted her head at the chair, almost as if she were listening for an answer. Then, with deliberate precision, she reached down and set it upright. The room seemed to sigh. "You see?" Charles forced a grin, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "Just a chair knocked over. Probably the wind or—" He stopped mid-sentence. There was no wind inside the house. Father Wallace moved closer, his eyes scanning the room. Did anyone see it fall? No one spoke. Not one of the guests had stepped back inside before now. If the chair had been knocked over by someone, they would have heard it. Annabelle's stomach churned. She felt the same oppressive sensation that had washed over her on the terrace. The certainty that something unseen was still here. Watching, waiting, Daniel exhaled sharply. "Let's get back to the reception," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority. "We're letting small things spook us?" The guests nodded, murmuring in agreement, eager to drown their unease in champagne and conversation. And just like that, the music resumed. The staff, though visibly uneasy, carried on with their duties. Laughter was forced, glasses were refilled, and soon, the guests convinced themselves that everything was normal again. Annabelle wanted to believe it too, but then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. At the long dining table, where the family had been seated, a chair was missing. Not overturned, not pushed back, just gone. She scanned the room quickly. There were supposed to be 12 seats at the main table. Now there were only 11. Her breath hitched. Had someone moved it? Had a staff member taken it away? But if they had, why would they remove only one? She turned to Eleanor, who was already staring at the empty space where the chair should have been. Eleanor knew. The older woman's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something. But instead, she picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip. Annabelle's hands felt clammy as she reached for Daniel's wrist. "The chair," she whispered. "One is missing." Daniel frowned, glancing toward the table. His expression shifted, his hand tensed beneath hers. He saw it too. Before either of them could speak, a new sound cut through the forced cheer of the reception. A sound so sharp, so utterly out of place that it silenced the entire room in an instant. It was the slow, deliberate creak of a chair being dragged across the wooden floor. But no one was touching it. The slow, deliberate creak of the chair scraping against the wooden floor sent a ripple of horror through the guests. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses trembled in unsteady hands, and every breath in the room seemed to pause at once. The sound was unmistakable, yet no one was near the missing chair. Annabelle's fingers dug into Daniel's arm. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, her breath shallow and tight. The chair, the one that had vanished, was moving back into place, unseen hands dragging it across the room with unnerving patience. Then it stopped, right where it had been before. A perfect, seamless return, as if it had never been gone at all. No one spoke. No one dared. It was Eleanor Lancaster who finally broke the silence. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and without hesitation, reached out. Her hand hovered just above the seat, as if she were considering whether or not to touch it. Then, slowly, she pulled the chair out. The wood groaned under her grip. It was solid, real, but it was ice cold. Eleanor's lips barely moved as she whispered, "He's here." A murmur rippled through the guests. Some gasped. Others glanced around in confusion, their fear thick but directionless. No one wanted to ask what Eleanor meant. No one wanted the answer. Father Wallace took a cautious step forward, his voice steady. "Eleanor, who is here?" Eleanor exhaled slowly, as though weighing the words in her mind before releasing them. "My brother." Annabelle's pulse stuttered. She had heard nothing about a brother. No whispers, no casual family anecdotes. The Lancasters were known for their wealth, their estate, their extravagant parties, but never had she heard mention of an unseen sibling. Eleanor let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, don't look so surprised. You think an old house like this doesn't keep its own secrets?" She tapped the chair lightly. This seat was never meant to be empty. Charles scoffed, his voice strained. "This is ridiculous. It's just a damn chair, Eleanor." He turned to the crowd, forcing a smirk. "Let's not let some old ghost stories ruin a perfectly good wedding." But even as he spoke, Annabelle could see the sweat beading at his temple. Eleanor tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. "You sound like my father," she mused. "He used to say the same thing. Right up until the night he refused to set a place for him." Annabelle felt her blood turn to ice. Charles rolled his eyes. "And what happened then?" Eleanor's smile faded. "He died." A collective shudder passed through the room. No one laughed. No one moved. The fire crackled in the background, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The music had stopped again, though no one could quite recall when. Annabelle swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does he want?" Eleanor's fingers ghosted over the back of the chair before letting go. "A seat at the table," she said. "And if we don't give it to him, he'll take one for himself." Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the chandeliers. The house had made its demand. The deep, thunderous slam of the door sent a violent tremor through the grand hall. Chandeliers swayed, silverware clattered against fine china, and the hushed whispers of terrified guests dissolved into a brittle silence. The house had spoken. Annabelle's heart pounded against her ribs. She turned instinctively toward the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the dining room, now sealed shut as if by an unseen force. A cold draft curled around her ankles, though every window was closed. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, struggling against an air that seemed suddenly too thick, too alive. Daniel's grip on her hand was tight, grounding her. Across the table, Eleanor Lancaster remained standing beside the restored chair, her fingers trailing its polished wooden back as if reacquainting herself with an old, unwanted acquaintance. Her expression was unreadable, neither frightened nor entirely at ease. Father Wallace was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, his voice wavering beneath an attempt at reassurance. "Eleanor, surely there is some rational explanation for all of this." Eleanor's gaze flicked toward him, her lips twitching in amusement. "Rational?" She let the word hang in the air like a question. "Father, tell me, do you truly believe the rational world governs this house?" No one dared to answer. Annabelle swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the chair and the doors. The very walls of the house seemed to press inward, as if listening. A deep, waiting stillness settled over them all, as though something unseen had joined them at the table, biding its time. A sudden noise shattered the quiet. Footsteps, slow, measured. They did not come from the hall, nor the servants' corridor, nor anywhere that could be easily explained. Instead, they resonated from above, from the empty upper floors of the estate, where no one had been all evening. Annabelle sucked in a breath. The sound did not belong to any of the guests, nor did it echo with the hurried pace of the waitstaff. No, this was something different, something deliberate. A cold sweat dampened Charles's brow. He turned to Eleanor, forcing an uneasy laugh. "Enough of this," he said. "This is just some elaborate joke, isn't it? A way to keep the family legacy alive? You think you can scare us with old stories?" And the footsteps stopped, directly above him. A deafening silence followed. Every guest stared at the ceiling, unmoving, barely breathing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the chandelier swayed, not from a draft, nor an accidental bump, but from something that had shifted the very air beneath it. Annabelle watched as Charles stiffened, his bravado fading. And then, just as quickly as they had stopped, the footsteps resumed, descending. Down the grand staircase. Toward them. Annabelle's stomach twisted. Whatever was moving toward them was not pretending to be part of this world. It was coming, claiming its place. Eleanor turned her gaze to the head of the table, where the missing chair had been returned. Her expression remained composed, but her voice held a quiet finality when she spoke. "I told you," she murmured. The seat was never meant to be empty. A final footstep echoed in the corridor just beyond the dining hall. The house fell silent. The guest had arrived. The room held its breath. The faint sound of footsteps had ceased, but the palpable presence of something, or someone, loomed just beyond the threshold of the dining room. The guests, motionless and wide-eyed, waited for the next movement, the next sound, or the next sign that they had all been plunged into something far beyond any normal wedding celebration. The weight in the air felt like a physical pressure on their chests, and each second stretched unbearably long. Annabelle felt as though her very skin were tightening. Her hand, still clutching Daniel's, was clammy, and his grip in return was just as desperate. They both stared at the door. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed oddly composed, standing still beside the chair that had once again returned to its rightful place at the table. Her hands were folded neatly before her gaze unwavering, directed toward the entrance. It was as if she had been expecting this all along, as though this moment were merely a prelude to something long anticipated. The guests shifted uneasily. Charles, still trying to maintain control over his own spiraling nerves, cleared his throat loudly. "I don't know what's going on here, but this isn't funny anymore." His voice was too loud, an attempt to break the silence, but it only seemed to make the tension thicker, more suffocating. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward him, her face unreadable. "It was never meant to be funny," she replied softly, her voice almost serene. "Not to you. But it wasn't a choice I made, Charles. It's been a long time since you chose to forget." Charles recoiled slightly, his face blanching. "Forget what? What are you talking about?" His voice shook, but he did his best to mask it behind a mask of indignation. "It's been many years, hasn't it?" Eleanor's eyes darkened slightly, a brief flicker of something unsettling passing across her features. "And yet, you've forgotten the rules of this house. Forgotten what it requires, what it demands when one ignores its ways, when one denies its history." Annabelle turned her gaze away from Eleanor, her mind racing. She was beginning to understand the words, understand what Eleanor meant, though it filled her with dread. There was something about the house, something deeply ingrained in its walls, its structure, and perhaps in its very foundation that demanded respect. Something that couldn't be bargained with or ignored. The air in the room grew colder, and then, as if on cue, the heavy oak doors began to creak open, not slowly or with hesitation, but with an undeniable force, as though someone was pushing against them from the other side. Annabelle's breath hitched. She had been expecting it, yes, but the suddenness of the movement caught her off guard. She saw the doors swing open wide, the light from the hallway spilling in, but it didn't illuminate what she had hoped. Instead, it merely deepened the shadows that already clung to the corners of the room. And then, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, as though the light itself recoiled from him. The shape of a man, at least it resembled a man, loomed in the threshold, his features obscured by the dimming light. His eyes, however, shone with an unsettling brilliance, familiar and alien at once, as if they were not entirely human. A murmur rippled through the room as the guests finally saw the figure clearly. It was as though the shadows themselves had formed him, and now he was stepping into the light. Who are you?" Daniel managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. The words seemed to fall from his lips in disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, he stepped forward, the air growing colder with each movement. It was as if the house itself was accepting him, accommodating him. And when the man finally took his place in the seat, everything inside the room shifted. Annabelle felt a strange vibration through her chest, something resonant in the very bones of the house. The walls groaned softly as the figure seated himself, the chair beneath him creaking with the weight of something ancient, something that did not belong in the mortal world. Eleanor looked on, her lips curling into a faint smile. "There, the guest has taken his place. The house has spoken, and we must listen." A single, oppressive silence filled the room. The guests stood frozen, unwilling to move or speak, each one questioning what had just transpired. Had the house truly chosen to welcome this thing? Or had they simply been swept into something far more terrifying than any of them could have imagined? And yet, despite the fear, despite the unknowns, one thing was unmistakable. The figure at the table had been invited. And in the deepest, most primal sense of the word, this house belonged to him. The figure in the chair remained silent, an enigma wrapped in shadow, as the house around him seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging his presence. The guests stood paralyzed, as if in some inexplicable trance, unable to escape the growing tension in the room. The flickering candlelight cast elongated shadows across their faces, distorting their expressions into masks of disbelief and fear. Annabelle could feel her pulse quicken, a knot tightening in her stomach, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure who had taken a seat at the table. Eleanor remained the only one unshaken, still standing by the side of the chair, as though this was all part of some predetermined plan. Her lips were barely moving, but she was speaking in a soft, almost inaudible murmur, as if trying to soothe something or someone in the darkness. Father Wallace, who had been standing by the hearth in stunned silence, finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and uncertain. This is madness. This is nothing less than madness. His eyes darted nervously between the figure and Eleanor, seeking some kind of reassurance or explanation. Who is he? What is he? Eleanor turned to him slowly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes held a strange mixture of sympathy and something else, something colder. You still don't understand, do you, Father? Her voice was low, almost sorrowful, but her words were sharp, like a quiet reproach. This is what the house demands. This is the way of it, and the house is always owed its due. Father Wallace recoiled, confusion and fear warping his features. The house, he repeated incredulously. What are you talking about? This is a family gathering, a wedding. This is supposed to be a celebration, not. His words trailed off as he glanced back at the figure in the chair, whose presence seemed to fill the entire room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, the atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken terror. Yet, none of them dared to ask the questions that burned on their tongues. What was this man, and why had he been allowed to join them? Why had he been invited to this place? A place that, until moments ago, had seemed like nothing more than an old mansion, full of history and tradition, but still a mansion all the same. Annabelle felt a chill settle deep in her bones, as though the house itself were watching her. The walls, once so still and dignified, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, vibrating with some unseen power. Her gaze shifted back to the figure, and she finally noticed the most unsettling detail of all, the absence of any reflection in the polished surface of the table before him. It was as though the man was not merely out of place. He was also out of time, or perhaps outside of the very reality they all inhabited. Her breath caught in her throat. She could no longer deny it. This wasn't just a man. This wasn't just an uninvited guest. This was something else. The figure shifted slightly, his head tilting ever so slightly, as though noticing her gaze. Annabelle couldn't help but shiver, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. He remained silent, but in that silence, something far more profound was communicated. There was a weight in the air, something ancient and malevolent, but also deeply knowing. A voice broke through the stillness. "Why are we here?" Charles asked, his voice trembling but forceful, as though he had suddenly found the courage to confront what was happening. His words were not directed at the figure, but at Eleanor, who still stood by the chair, looking almost serene in the midst of the chaos. "Why has this thing been allowed into our family gathering? What is happening here?" Eleanor's eyes softened slightly, but the smile that curved her lips was not one of warmth. It was thin, barely perceptible. "Why?" she repeated, almost to herself. "Why indeed?" She stepped forward, casting a glance toward the figure who had remained utterly still. "The answer, Charles, is simpler than you think. The house is called, and what the house calls for, it claims. It doesn't ask, nor does it explain. It takes." The weight of her words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. No one spoke for a long while, and it seemed as though the very house itself had paused to listen. Finally, Daniel, whose face had been drawn tight with anxiety, whispered, almost to himself, "What does it want?" Eleanor's gaze flicked toward him, her eyes hard and unwavering. "What it wants is not for us to know," she said quietly. "But what we must understand is that we are here because it has decided we must be. And those who do not heed the call, well, they are left to fade. The house always claims its due." Annabelle could feel the panic rising in her chest. She glanced toward the door, wondering if it was even possible to escape, to run from this place. But something deep inside her told her that no escape was possible. Not now. Not when the house had already claimed them. The figure finally shifted, its movements slow and deliberate. It was as though the house itself were propelling him forward, his body responding not of its own volition, but as part of something far larger, far more powerful than anyone in the room could comprehend. The air grew colder still, and with each passing second, it felt as though the walls of the mansion were closing in around them, tightening like a noose. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the figure spoke. "We all have our roles to play." His voice was deep, rich, and oddly familiar, yet so distant. "You are here because you belong here. And now, you must accept your place." Annabelle's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? What role did they have to play in this twisted game? Was it too late to fight back? Or had they already surrendered to the house's dark grip? Eleanor's cold eyes met hers. "The house will not release what it has claimed," she whispered. "And neither will you." As the last word escaped the figure's lips, an unnatural stillness fell over the room. It wasn't just the air that had grown thick, but the entire house. Its very foundation seemed to tremble with an ancient, unshakable power. The walls, once proud and solid, now appeared to pulse, as if breathing. There was no doubt left in anyone's mind that they were no longer in control of their fates. Whatever force had taken hold of the house was not bound by time, reason, or any earthly law. It had its own rules none of them understood. Annabelle felt a sharp chill crawl up her spine, and for the first time in the evening, she could not help but let out a soft gasp of terror. It was happening. The house had claimed them. There was no turning back. The oppressive energy in the room weighed heavy on her chest, and she wondered if she could even summon enough breath to speak. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to escape. But deep down, she knew there was nowhere to go. The house had already made its choice. Eleanor remained standing beside the chair, her expression one of calm surrender, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. In a way, perhaps she had. The look in her eyes was one of understanding, one of acceptance, but it was not shared by anyone else in the room. The guests were still frozen, some with looks of confusion, others with outright fear. No one spoke, as though the very air around them had stolen their words. The figure in the chair, though immobile, seemed to exude a palpable sense of authority, of finality. Father Wallace, who had been trembling with dread since the figure spoke, managed to find his voice at last. His tone was ragged, desperate, as though clinging to the last shred of his faith. "Please, what is this? What do you want from us? Why are we here? What do we have to do with all of this?" The figure's response came not in words, but in the way the room seemed to react. The temperature dropped suddenly, so sharply that the air felt like ice against Annabelle's skin. The flickering candlelight dimmed, and the shadows grew, swallowing the room in their depths. The very house itself seemed to groan, as though acknowledging Father Wallace's question with disdain. Eleanor finally stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "This is the moment, Father. The moment you should have anticipated long ago." Her voice had grown colder, but there was a sadness in it too, a resigned sorrow that clung to her words. "This house does not want anything from us. It already has everything. It has claimed us. It has claimed all of us." Annabelle's mind was racing. There was something about Eleanor's words that unsettled her further. This wasn't just some malicious force. This wasn't an evil entity or spirit that had taken hold of them. It was the house itself. This entity, this force, had lived and breathed through the house for centuries, and now it had chosen to act. There was no escaping it. They were all part of its history, woven into its fabric, whether they wanted to be or not. As Eleanor's words sank in, The weight of the situation became unbearable. Annabelle's thoughts spun, and yet in the midst of her confusion, one image persisted, a fleeting memory of her grandmother's warning. Never stay too long. Never let the house claim you. But it was too late now. There was no running, no escaping. The house had taken what it wanted. It had already sealed their fate. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the room slammed shut with such force that it rattled the windows. The sound was deafening, and the movement of the heavy would send a shockwave through the guests, snapping them out of their stupor, if only for a moment. Annabelle's heart skipped a beat as the room seemed to hold its collective breath, awaiting what would come next. The figure in the chair did not move, but its presence had grown somehow more imposing, more suffocating. The shadows seemed to cling to its form, as though refusing to let it go. Father Wallace, eyes wide with terror, staggered backward, his hand instinctively clutching his rosary. "What have we done? What are we supposed to do?" His voice cracked, the question more for himself than anyone else. Is there no hope? Is there no salvation? But Eleanor's expression softened, and in that softness, there was a painful truth. "There is no salvation here, Father. You were never meant to be saved." She turned to Annabelle, her gaze piercing as if she could see through her very soul. "We were never meant to be saved. We are the guests here, and we are the ones who are being consumed." Annabelle's breath hitched in her throat. Consumed? The word echoed through her mind, and with it came an understanding so horrifying that it made her skin crawl. This wasn't just a haunting, a curse, or even a possession. This was something deeper. The house had been waiting for them. It had been watching them all, pulling them in, and now that they were here, it was claiming them, body, mind, and soul. A sudden noise interrupted her thoughts, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the house itself. It was a thudding, like the sound of something ancient and heavy stirring beneath the floorboards. The sound echoed in the room, vibrating through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The guests exchanged frantic glances, but none of them moved. They couldn't. They were paralyzed, as though the very ground beneath them had frozen their limbs in place. The figure's voice cut through the noise, its deep, unsettling tone once again breaking the silence. "The final seal has been broken." The word seemed to hang in the air like a death sentence. "Now, the house's true nature shall be revealed." At that moment, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into total darkness. The darkness was all-consuming. The thick blackness swallowed every ounce of light, leaving nothing but oppressive emptiness in its wake. Annabelle's heart pounded wildly in her chest, the frantic thumping in her ears drowning out the eerie silence. She could feel the cold air brush against her skin, but it was not the usual chill of a power outage. This was something deeper, something more sinister. The air felt alive with an unseen presence, an unseen force that had now fully awakened. In the darkness, time seemed to distort. It was impossible to know how long they stood there, frozen in place. Annabelle could hear the muffled gasps of the other guests, their breathing rapid and shallow, but it sounded so distant, like they were trapped in another world entirely. Her eyes darted around in the blackness, but she saw nothing. The shadows had swallowed the room whole, leaving only the vague outlines of those closest to her. Then, there was a sound, a faint whisper, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder. The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, like the wind carrying secrets from long-forgotten corners of the house. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it quickly became a cacophony of voices. There were too many to count, speaking in languages Annabelle didn't recognize. The words were frantic, incoherent, but their tone was unmistakable, pleading, begging, a desperate cry for mercy. It was then that Annabelle realized the house was speaking. The voices were not of the guests. They were not even the voices of the figure who had been sitting in the chair. These were the voices of the house itself, the souls that had been trapped within its walls, prisoners of a curse that spanned centuries. They were the ones who had been consumed, just as Eleanor had predicted. A sudden, sharp cry from the other side of the room snapped Annabelle out of her trance. She wasn't sure who had screamed, but the terror in the sound was unmistakable. Someone had moved. Someone had dared to break the stillness. Before she could process what had happened, the lights flickered once again, briefly casting a weak, ghostly glow across the room. In that fleeting moment, Annabelle caught sight of Eleanor standing motionless in the corner, her face expressionless, her eyes empty. The moment the light returned to darkness, it was as though Eleanor had never been there. It was as though the room itself had swallowed her whole. A voice broke the suffocating silence. Father WOES. His voice was trembling, almost incomprehensible. What is happening? Where is she? Where did she go? The others began to stir, but it was too late. The house had already begun to claim them. Annabelle could feel the pressure mounting in the room, a force that seemed to be squeezing in from all sides. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing them all toward an inevitable fate. The floor creaked beneath her, the wooden planks groaning in protest, but it wasn't the sound of old wood. It was the sound of something far more sinister, something alive. In the distance, through the blinding darkness, Annabelle thought she saw something move. A faint shadow, barely discernible against the blackness, but unmistakably there. Her pulse quickened as she tried to focus, but every time she thought she saw it, the shadow shifted, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. Was she imagining things? Or was the house beginning to play tricks on her mind? The whispers continued, rising in pitch and intensity. The voices were no longer desperate. They were angry now. The house had tasted their fear, and it wanted more. The walls, now pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, began to echo the maddening voices, their discordant cries tearing at Annabelle's sanity. It was impossible to escape the feeling that the house itself was alive, breathing, watching them with its unseen eyes. It had known they would come. It had known they would wander into its grasp. Father WOES, still gripped by fear, stumbled toward the center of the room, muttering frantically, "This can't be real. This is impossible. This has to be a dream, a nightmare. It has to be." His voice broke, and for a brief moment, he seemed to crumble under the weight of the terror that pressed down on him. His hand shot out in a futile gesture, as if trying to ward off the suffocating presence that filled the room. But it was useless. Annabelle could feel it too, the cold, the weight, the presence. It wasn't just terror anymore. This was something far worse. This was the beginning of madness. The very fabric of reality was fraying, twisting, warping under the pressure of whatever force had taken hold of the house. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light flickered back to life. It wasn't bright. No, the light was dim and weak, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach out, crawling across the walls. But it was enough. Enough to see the room once again, and enough to see the consequences of their actions. Eleanor was gone. The chair where she had stood moments before was now empty, the seat cold and untouched. It was as though she had never been there at all. But the others were still there. For now, they were all still alive. But how much longer could they last in this maddening, shifting reality? How much longer before the house swallowed them whole? Annabelle's mind reeled. Was it too late to escape? Were any of them truly safe anymore? And if they weren't, what kind of life would remain for those who had been claimed? She felt a deep, gnawing fear that this was only the beginning of their torment. The worst had yet to come. The silence that followed the flickering of the lights was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the complete and utter lack of life. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, suffocating everything around it. Even the breath of the guests had become slow, labored, as if they, too, were beginning to sense the gravity of the situation. Annabelle stood frozen in place, her body shaking as she tried to make sense of what had just transpired. Her mind reeled with the absence of Eleanor, the sudden disappearance of the woman who had guided them all into this nightmare. And yet, despite the confusion and fear swirling around her, something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite place. There was a deeper layer to this, something that had been hidden in the shadows, something that had yet to reveal itself. The house was not merely alive, it was intelligent, purposeful. It had been waiting, watching, for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The whispers had quieted, but the tension in the room was palpable, almost tangible. The guests had scattered, but no one dared to speak. Father Wallace had gone rigid in his corner, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for something he couldn't name. And in the farthest corner, Annabelle could just make out the shadow of the chair where Eleanor had once stood. It was empty now, but there was an unsettling aura lingering in its place, as though it still held some part of her. It was as if Eleanor had never left, or worse, as if she had simply ceased to be. It was then that Annabelle noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The house, or perhaps something in it, was pulling them toward a truth they weren't ready to face. She had always known there were things in the world that went beyond human understanding, things that couldn't be explained with logic or science. But this was something else entirely. This was beyond belief. Annabelle took a hesitant step forward, her feet unsteady on the old wooden floorboards. She looked around at the others, the other guests who had all become unwilling participants in this twisted game. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, and yet there was an unmistakable exhaustion etched into their expressions. They had been here too long. They had seen too much, and yet none of them seemed willing to leave, or perhaps they couldn't. The house had bound them in ways they didn't understand. She turned her attention back to the now empty chair. Eleanor's disappearance had been too abrupt, too precise. It wasn't like someone simply leaving the room. It was as if she had never been there at all. A strange thought bubbled to the surface of Annabelle's mind, one that seemed too bizarre to entertain, but one she couldn't shake. Could it be possible that Eleanor had never been real? Had she been some sort of apparition, a guiding force meant to lead them to this exact moment? Or had Eleanor herself been taken by the house, as they were all destined to be? The whispers started again, softer now, but far more urgent. They were not the voices of the house, not anymore. These voices were familiar, laced with recognition. Annabelle's heart skipped a beat as she realized the whispers were speaking her name. Over and over, the sound of her name being dragged through the walls like a broken record. It was then that she saw it, a flash of light so bright it momentarily blinded her, followed by the distinct outline of a figure at the far end of the room. The figure was tall, thin, and draped in shadows, but the shape of the figure was unmistakable. It was Eleanor, but she wasn't the same. Eleanor's eyes, once calm and knowing, were now wide open in a grotesque, unnatural way. Her skin seemed to stretch unnaturally over her bones, her mouth slightly ajar as if she were trying to speak but couldn't quite form words. Her body was not quite in the shape of a human anymore, a twisted parody of the person she had been. The air grew thick as the figure moved, its movements jerky, disjointed, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It was not the Eleanor they had known, but something else entirely. Annabelle gasped, stepping back in horror, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The figure of Eleanor continued to move toward them, its presence chilling the room further. The others had begun to notice too, their eyes wide in shock, but no one dared to speak. They couldn't. It was as though the very air had become solid, oppressive. Every word felt like a scream, trapped in their throats. Where did she go? Father Wallace's voice trembled, his eyes fixed on the figure that now stood before them. What is this? What has happened to her? His words were a whisper of disbelief, as though he was desperately clinging to the belief that everything could be explained, that this was just some kind of hallucination. But deep down, Annabelle knew. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a dream. This was real, and it was happening to them. For the first time since they had entered the house, Annabelle understood the true horror of their situation. They had not simply wandered into a haunted house. They had stepped into something much darker, much older. This place was alive, and it had been waiting for them, for their souls, for their fear. They were not its first victims, and they would not be its last. The house had been collecting pieces of them, pulling them apart bit by bit, until there was nothing left but their terror. And now, as Eleanor's twisted form drew closer, Annabelle realized with a sickening certainty that they were no longer guests at a wedding. They were prisoners, trapped in a cycle of horror they would never escape. The house had won, and there was nothing left but its hunger for more. The room remained still, the oppressive silence almost unbearable as Eleanor's twisted form continued to loom over the guests. Annabelle, her heart hammering in her chest, couldn't tear her eyes away from the grotesque figure. Her mind, too stunned to fully process the horror unfolding before her, struggled to make sense of the impossible. Had the woman who had guided them into this nightmare truly been nothing more than a pawn, a part of the house's twisted game? Or had she, too, been a victim? There were no answers, only the sickening realization that they were in far deeper than they could have ever anticipated. Father Wallace, his face ashen, was the first to recover from the shock. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the wall for support, his breath shallow and rapid. This isn't possible," he murmured, as though saying the words aloud might somehow make them less real. "This isn't her. This isn't Eleanor." But Annabelle knew better. The voice of Eleanor, the gentle, knowing voice that had once calmed their fears, now echoed in her mind, distorted and twisted. She could hear the faintest traces of it, a soft whisper beneath the unnatural stillness of the room. There was no mistaking it. The house had taken her, had twisted her into something unrecognizable, just as it had done with everything else it touched. The dread that settled over Annabelle was suffocating. This was no longer just a house. It was a predator, devouring everything in its path. The figure of Eleanor, or what was left of her, continued to stand there, unmoving. Her eyes, now black and empty, stared straight through them, as though seeing nothing, yet somehow seeing everything. It was as if the house itself had consumed her soul, leaving behind only the husk of her body to serve as a vessel for its dark power. Annabelle's thoughts raced. They had all come here for a wedding, to celebrate love and unity, and now they were entangled in a nightmare that defied all logic. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled. But she knew, deep down, that the house was not just toying with them. It was feeding off their fear, their confusion, drawing them into its web one by one. They had been its prey from the moment they stepped across its threshold. The very nature of the place was darkness, a malevolent force that reveled in the chaos it created. How do we stop it? Annabelle's voice trembled as she asked the question aloud, the question that had been on everyone's mind since they first entered the house. But there were no answers, only silence, thick and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting. Father Wallace shook his head, his eyes darting around the room. I don't know. There must be something, some way to break the cycle. We can't just let it claim us all." Annabelle's gaze shifted to the other guests, who were now clustered together, huddled in fear. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. No one spoke. They were too afraid to. Fear, the kind that gripped the soul and paralyzed the body, had taken root in all of them. It was no longer just a threat that loomed in the shadows. It had become a part of them. They were all bound by the house, trapped in a web of its making. The whispering voices from the walls began again, their tone more insistent now, more frantic. Annabelle could hear her own name among the hushed murmurs, along with the names of the other guests, as though the house was calling them, beckoning them closer to the brink. It was as though the house was aware of their every move, their every thought, and it reveled in their fear, in their helplessness. As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped, a chill so intense that Annabelle could see her breath clouding in the air. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was an unnatural cold, one that seeped into her bones and froze her very soul. It was as though the house itself was exhaling, its breath a cold, malignant force that seeped into every crevice, every corner of the room. Father Wallace turned sharply, his eyes wide with panic. "The door! We have to get out! We can't stay here!" His voice was frantic now, breaking through the tension, the fear that had taken hold of them all. But it was too late. The door, the one they had come through so easily before, was now sealed shut. There was no way out, no escape. Annabelle's heart sank. They were trapped, not just in the house, but in its grip. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. The house wasn't just holding them prisoner physically, it was ensnaring them mentally, emotionally, dragging them deeper into the darkness with each passing moment. The walls, the floors, the very air they breathed. Everything had become part of its malignant force. And then, in a moment of eerie clarity, Annabelle understood. The house was not just a place. It was a living entity, a creature that fed off the energy of its victims, trapping them in an endless loop of torment and despair. The wedding, the celebration of love, had been nothing more than a prelude, a ritual to draw them in. They were never meant to escape. With a sudden, terrifying realization, Annabelle turned toward the others. "It wants us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wants all of us, our souls, our fears. It's been feeding on us from the moment we arrived. We can't fight it. We have to." But before she could finish her thought, the room seemed to pulse with energy. The shadows that had once been static now began to shift, swirling around them like a storm. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. The house, it seemed, had made its decision. It would not let them leave. As the darkness closed in around them, Annabelle realized with a chilling certainty that they had never truly been in control. The house had always been in charge, and now, as the shadows engulfed them, they were nothing more than playthings in its eternal game. The wedding, once a symbol of joy and union, had become their final funeral, a twisted end to the celebration they had never asked for. The oppressive stillness in the room grew heavier with every passing second. Annabelle's chest tightened as the air thickened around them, becoming almost tangible, as though the house itself were exhaling its breath. The walls seemed to hum with a low, guttural sound, a sound that was not just heard, but felt deep within the bones. It was as if the house, in its malevolent hunger, was savoring every moment, drawing closer to its prey. The group stood in a huddled mass, fear radiating from each person, their bodies trembling involuntarily. They had no illusions left about the nature of the house. They were trapped. There was no escape. The door was still sealed shut, its once familiar frame now an impenetrable barrier. The only way out was forward, deeper into the heart of the house. But that, Annabelle knew, was a path that would lead them to an even darker fate. Father Wallace, who had been the voice of reason up until this point, was now shaking, his eyes wild with panic. His earlier belief that they could somehow fight back had crumbled. "It's feeding on us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's what this is. It's a ritual. The house has always done this. It devours us, our fear, our despair. And now it's too strong. We can't fight it. We are its food." Annabelle swallowed hard. The truth was undeniable. She had felt it, the way the house seemed to draw them in, how it fed on their fear, on their confusion. It wasn't just a house. It was a creature, a living entity, one that had learned to thrive on the emotions of those who entered it. The laughter, the joy, the love, they had all been part of its feast, luring them in with promises of a celebration. And now, the real hunger had begun. The others, though still visibly shaken, began to murmur among themselves. The group had been separated by fear, each person withdrawing into themselves, trying to find some way to understand the terror that was now consuming them. Annabelle's mind raced, trying to form a plan, but the more she thought, the more hopeless the situation seemed. There were no answers here, no solutions, only questions and the gnawing dread that something far worse was coming. Eleanor, or the thing that had once been Eleanor, stood at the center of the room, unmoving. Her eyes, black and vacant, stared ahead, unfocused, as though waiting. Annabelle couldn't bring herself to look at her for long. There was something about the stillness of that twisted form that sent a shiver down her spine. It was as though Eleanor had become something more than human, a vessel for the house's malevolent will. And that, in turn, made Annabelle question everything. Had Eleanor ever truly been real, or had she too been a creation of the house from the beginning? The temperature in the room dropped again, and Annabelle could see her breath misting in front of her. The others were starting to feel it too, the chill that seeped into their very bones, numbing them, freezing them from the inside out. The shadows began to shift once more, but this time there was no subtlety. The darkness spread, creeping along the walls, moving like liquid, as though the house itself were alive, moving, feeding. Annabelle could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, the suffocating grip of the house taking hold of her mind. Her thoughts became erratic, her breath shallow. Panic clawed at her chest. She could feel her own fear, the way it welled up within her, fueling the house, feeding it. Every fear she had ever suppressed, every doubt, every regret, they were all being drawn out, magnified by the house, twisted into something monstrous. And as they rose within her, so too did the power of the house. "Annabelle, we need to get out," someone whispered urgently beside her. She turned to see Michael, one of the other guests, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with terror, and his voice trembled. "We can't stay here. It's feeding off us. We have to find a way out." His words snapped Annabelle out of her panic, if only for a moment. She could see the fear in his eyes, mirrored in the faces of the others. They were all thinking the same thing, escape. But as the shadows deepened, as the house seemed to pulse with its dark energy, she realized that escaping was no longer an option. Not unless they faced what the house truly wanted, unless they confronted the terrible hunger it had for them. The house, in its cruel and predatory nature, had a singular goal: to consume them. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The emotions they experienced, their fear, their terror, their sorrow, were the sustenance the house craved. It wasn't enough to simply trap them. It needed their despair to survive, to grow stronger. And as Annabelle looked around the room, she realized that each of them, in their own way, had already been consumed. The house had worked its way into their hearts, their minds, until it was impossible to tell where they ended and the house began. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech echoed from the walls, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. It was a sound of hunger, of need. The shadows writhed, twisting, until they coalesced into a single, massive form. It was no longer just darkness. It was a shape, a silhouette, an immense shadow that stretched toward them like a living thing. Annabelle could feel the force of it, the pull, as though it were calling to her, beckoning her to join it. The realization hit her all at once, crashing over her like a tidal wave. The house was not just trying to consume them, it was trying to turn them into part of it, to bind them to its endless hunger. It had done it to Eleanor. It had done it to so many others before. And now, it was ready to do it to them. The walls, the shadows, the very air, they were all part of the house's hunger, its insatiable thirst for the souls it devoured. Annabelle's heart raced, and she instinctively took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in around her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that she was already too far gone. The house had already claimed her. The wedding, the celebration of love, it had all been part of the ritual, part of the feast. There was no escape from the house's hunger. And in that moment, Annabelle knew. They had all been doomed from the start. The shadows had gathered fully by now, swirling around the room like an ominous, suffocating mist. Annabelle's heart hammered in her chest, every beat resonating with a dreadful understanding. The house, the very walls they had once thought safe, had become a predator, and they were its prey. It wasn't just the darkness or the horrific images they had witnessed, but the gnawing realization that they were not only trapped physically in the house, but spiritually, emotionally bound to it. The house had turned from a venue for celebration into a living, breathing entity, feeding on the fear, sorrow, and terror that pulsed through their veins. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The words felt wrong, as though the very act of speaking would amplify the darkness that had begun to suffocate the room. Around her, the others were silent, their eyes wide with the shared recognition that there was no escape from the suffocating grip of this malevolent force. The house had already begun to take its toll on them, feeding on their worst fears, turning them into mere vessels of despair. Father Wallace was the first to speak, though his voice was weak, shaking with a mix of fear and resignation. It knows everything. This house, it knows what we fear the most, what we regret, and it uses that against us. There is no way out. There never was. He paused, the weight of his words sinking deep into the group, as though he too had come to the realization that they were all doomed to become part of the house's endless hunger. Annabelle's mind raced, but it could no longer think clearly. The darkness around them seemed to drain her of all rational thought, distorting her perception of time, of space. The house had become a labyrinth, its corridors stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. Even the rooms themselves had taken on a strange, malleable quality, their dimensions no longer fixed. The very air they breathed seemed thick with malevolence. Every inhalation a poison, every exhalation a prayer for release. As the shadows continued to stretch across the room, Annabelle turned to face Eleanor. The twisted, contorted version of the woman she had once known was still standing motionless at the center of the room. There was something disturbingly calm about her now, as if she had already surrendered to the house's will. But in her eyes, Annabelle saw something else, something darker, something hungry. Eleanor wasn't just a victim of the house. She had become part of it. She had become its instrument. A cold laugh echoed from the far corners of the room, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that reverberated in Annabelle's chest. It wasn't a sound made by any of the guests. It was the house itself, taking pleasure in their fear, in their helplessness. The shadows moved again, curling and writhing, a vast mass that seemed to take form in front of her. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, thin figure, its features obscured by the shifting gloom. It was wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress, but it was stained, torn, and soiled, its once pristine white fabric now a sickly shade of gray. The figure's eyes gleamed with malice, and the closer it came, the more Annabelle realized that this wasn't just a manifestation of the house. This was something else, something ancient and horrific. It spoke, its voice low and chilling. You are here to join the feast. You have already been chosen. The house is fed upon your fears, your despair, your very souls. And now, you will become part of it. You will feed it, and it will feed upon you, endlessly. Forever. The figure's voice was hypnotic, each word sending a shock through Annabelle's body. It felt like the house itself was speaking through this abomination, like the very foundation of the building was resonating with the words, vibrating in her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words caught in her throat. The house had already claimed her. There was no room left for rebellion. She looked around, her gaze landing on the others. Their faces were pale, hollow, as if they had already surrendered to the inevitable. Father Wallace's eyes were glassy, his lips parted as though in silent prayer. Michael, the man who had once urged them to find a way out, stood frozen, his body trembling as the shadows consumed him. They were all fading, losing themselves to the house. It was as if their identities, their memories, were being drained from them, replaced by an empty, gnawing void. But Annabelle couldn't surrender. Not completely. A spark of defiance remained deep inside her, a flickering ember of resistance. She had to fight back, even if it seemed hopeless. She couldn't allow the house to win. Not after everything they had been through. Not after the countless lives it had already consumed. She would find a way out, even if it meant facing whatever dark forces the house had waiting for her. As if in response to her defiance, the air grew even colder. The shadows swirled faster, coiling tighter around her like a noose. The house seemed to tighten its grip, forcing her to confront the one thing she had been avoiding, the truth. The house had always been there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. It had used the wedding as bait, a lure to pull them into its hungry maw. It had fed off their joy, their love, and now it was time to feast on their fear, their regret. Annabelle's thoughts became fragmented, her resolve slipping away as the darkness consumed her. The figure in the wedding dress moved closer, and she felt the pull of its power, the suffocating weight of its presence. The room seemed to warp and bend, the walls stretching, narrowing and closing in on her. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the darkness finally claimed her, she knew that she was no longer Annabelle. She was part of the house now, a part of its endless hunger, its eternal feast. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the voice of the house, whispering in her ear, "Welcome to the feast, my dear." When Annabelle's consciousness returned, it was not with the clarity of the waking world, but in the kind of fog that fills the spaces between sleep and wakefulness. Her body was heavy, as though encased in 1,000 layers of cold, suffocating material. The first thing she realized was that she could no longer move. The darkness that had overwhelmed her was not just external, it was internal, weaving itself into her very being. The shadows had consumed her, just as they had consumed the others. They had taken her mind, her soul, her very essence, and now she was no more than a hollow vessel, waiting to be filled by the insatiable hunger of the house. She could feel the presence of the others, too, though their shapes were not clear. Their forms flickered in and out of focus, as though they were caught between the physical world and something darker, something far more malevolent. They had been taken, each one of them, and now they shared her fate, their lives twisted and bound to the house in ways that defied explanation. They were no longer individuals, no longer people. They had become one with the darkness, just as she had. The house was alive. Annabelle had always known that there was something wrong about it, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human comprehension. But now, in this state between the physical world and whatever awaited her beyond, she understood the true nature of the house. It was a parasite, a being that fed not on food or sustenance, but on fear, regret, and despair. It consumed the emotions of those who entered, feeding on their deepest vulnerabilities, turning their lives into a banquet for its endless hunger. It wasn't just the house that had driven them to the brink. It was the house that had created them, that had shaped their every thought and every fear. They were all part of it, and it was part of them. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard whispers, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a windless night. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into words, and though she couldn't make out what was being said, the tone was unmistakable. It was cruel, mocking, the laughter of a predator circling its prey. Annabelle tried to reach out, to grasp at the words, to make sense of the madness that had claimed her. But there was nothing, only the void, only the suffocating emptiness that consumed all thoughts of escape. And then she felt it, cold fingers brushing against her skin, as though the darkness itself were reaching out to touch her. The sensation was wrong, alien, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered in a way that she could not comprehend. The fingers tightened, pulling her deeper into the void, pulling her toward something, toward the center of the darkness, where the shadows were thickest, where the hunger was strongest. The walls around her seemed to pulse with a life of their own, expanding and contracting like the chest of a beast in the throes of an insatiable hunger. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the scent of something long dead, and yet, as Annabelle inhaled, she could feel it filling her lungs, settling into her chest. The house was feeding on her, feeding on all of them. The process was slow, deliberate, as if the house were savoring every moment, every drop of fear, every tear of regret. They were not just victims, they were the feast. Her thoughts blurred, and for a moment, she thought she could see a flicker of light, dim, distant, almost like a star on the edge of the horizon. But it wasn't light. It was an illusion, a trick of the mind, something the house had conjured to distract her, to give her false hope. Hope was the enemy here. Hope only fed the house, made it stronger. The shadows knew this. The darkness thrived on it. "Why did you come?" a voice asked, but the words weren't spoken aloud. They reverberated inside her head, filling every corner of her mind. The voice was not just a voice. It was a presence, a part of the house itself, something ancient and malevolent. The voice twisted and writhed like a serpent, coiling around her thoughts. "You knew this place was cursed, and yet you came. You were drawn here like all the others before you, and now you belong to me." The voice grew louder, the pressure building inside her skull. Annabelle wanted to scream, to fight, to claw her way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing to grasp, no way to escape. The darkness had consumed her completely. It wasn't just her body that was trapped. It was her mind, her soul, every aspect of her being. She was one with the shadows, and the shadows were one with the house. A sudden surge of energy shot through her, and for a brief moment, she thought she could break free. Her fingers twitched, her limbs responded, and she felt a sliver of defiance rise in her chest. Was there a way out? Could she still fight back? But before she could act, the energy faded, replaced by a crushing weight that pressed down on her chest. It wasn't just the darkness that was suffocating her. It was the house itself, its very presence a force of unimaginable power. As her mind slipped further into the abyss, she heard the sounds of the others, their screams, their pleas, their whispers, all blending into a cacophony of despair. They were all trapped, all consumed by the same fate. There was no escape. There was no way to free them. Annabelle closed her eyes, but even in the darkness, she could still feel the house watching, waiting. It was a predator, and they were its prey. There was no end to its hunger. The feast would never stop. It would go on, forever, as long as the house remained. And in that moment, Annabelle understood that they were not the victims. They had always been the feast. In the suffocating darkness that held them all captive, Annabelle had begun to lose any sense of time or reality. She couldn't remember the moment when her body had first succumbed to the pull of the house, nor could she recall when her consciousness had split into fragmented thoughts, unable to distinguish dream from waking. The house had become a physical manifestation of her despair, an entity far more monstrous than she could ever have imagined, something that thrived not on flesh, but on the disintegration of the human soul. She had become one with the house, and the horror of that truth was more chilling than anything she could have anticipated. As she lay trapped within the dark recesses of her own mind, part of her still clung to the faintest thread of hope. It was a thread so small that it barely seemed to exist, yet it refused to break, as though something deep within her could not fully surrender. There were moments when she could almost feel the weight of the others, those who had come before her, those who had failed to escape the house's twisted grasp. It was as though they were still there, their spirits lingering, lost in the same maze of shadows, unable to leave and yet unwilling to fully embrace the darkness. But it was when she felt that presence, that invisible tether connecting them all, that a realization began to form, fragile but undeniable. The house did not just consume its inhabitants. It twisted their very existence, reshaping their souls into something it could use, something it could feed on. It wasn't a haunted house, not in the traditional sense. It was alive, a living entity that evolved with each passing moment, each moment of despair. And with that knowledge, Annabelle understood that escape was impossible, not because the house physically trapped them, but because it had become a part of them. The moment they entered, they had already been claimed, already consumed. She tried to reach for that thread of hope, to pull it from the abyss, to make sense of it, to find a way to turn the tables. But the house refused to let her. The shadows pressed in closer, tightening their grip on her psyche. It whispered, not in words, but in sensations. Icy fingers, tightening in her chest, a sense of choking fear that made her breath shallow, rapid. The house knew her fear, had always known it, and it used it to feed. It wasn't just the fear of the dark, of being trapped. It was the fear of failure, of abandonment, of being forgotten. And now, those fears swirled around her, feeding the beast, giving it strength. As she struggled against the suffocating grip of the house, the sound of the others' voices reached her once more. Faint at first, like whispers in a distant wind, but growing louder with each passing moment. There was something different about them now. The voices, once filled with anguish, were now suffused with a strange, hollow quality. They no longer seemed like the voices of people. They were like echoes, reflections of lives that had been erased. These were not the living. These were the lost. These were the remnants of people who had once been real, now reduced to nothing more than spectral whispers in the dark. And yet, as the voices grew louder, something shifted inside Annabelle. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was no longer consumed by the house's presence. She felt something outside of herself, something distant but real, like a pinprick of light on the horizon. It was a memory of the wedding, the joy, the laughter, the love that had once filled the space. The faces of the people she had known, her family, her friends, all gathered together in celebration. That moment, frozen in time, seemed so distant now. But it was there, somewhere in the back of her mind, a faint reminder of a life before the darkness. Could it still be possible to reclaim that? Could it still be possible to break free? Her heart quickened with an urgency that surprised her. There had to be a way. If the house thrived on despair, surely it could also be driven back by hope. She had seen it in those fleeting moments when her mind had cleared, those precious flashes of clarity that had offered her the smallest glimpse of possibility. If she could summon that hope, if she could anchor herself to that memory of love, perhaps she could break free. It was a foolish thought, a child's fantasy perhaps, but in the overwhelming darkness, it was all she had left. Her mind reached out, groping blindly for that elusive thread, willing it to become something solid, something real. The darkness roiled around her, threatening to consume her entirely, but she held on, reaching further, pulling herself through the suffocating blackness. She focused on the faces, the warmth, the laughter. She let the memory fill her, let it swirl inside her like a burst of light in the abyss. But the house would not let her have it. The moment she touched that memory, that fleeting glimpse of happiness, the shadows retaliated. They curled and writhed, snapping around her like serpents, choking off the thread of light before it could fully form. The house knew that hope was dangerous. It was the one thing that could weaken it, and it fought to hold on to its power, to hold her in the endless void. As the darkness pressed in once more, Annabelle felt the edges of her mind begin to blur. She could no longer tell if she was inside the house or if the house had now become part of her. There was no distinction. There was no escape. She could feel her mind stretching and warping, pulled in 1,000 directions at once. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed them all. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, were growing louder still, swirling around her in a chaotic cacophony. They were all lost now, every one of them, trapped in the house's endless hunger. And so, Annabelle understood, with a cold clarity, that there would be no redemption, no triumph over the darkness. Hope had been a fleeting dream, a ghostly illusion. She was part of the house now, just another shadow in its endless feast. There was no escaping what she had become. And as the last vestiges of her consciousness flickered, she heard the final words that sealed her fate. Words that she had known all along, but that now rang with a finality she could not ignore. You were never meant to leave. The house had become a part of Annabelle's soul. No longer could she distinguish where her body ended and the darkness began. It was a feeling not of dissolution, but of becoming one with something ancient and vast, a presence that stretched across eternity. Her memories had blurred into the fabric of the house. Her identity mingled with the very walls that had once confined her. What remained of Annabelle, the woman she had once been, was now a mere whisper, a fragment floating in the blackness. Time, as it once was, had ceased to exist in this place. There were no days or nights, no seasons to mark the passing of moments. It was as if the house existed outside the bounds of the natural world, transcending the simple laws of existence. And in this endless, suspended moment, Annabelle understood something profound. She was not the first to be consumed by the house. She had merely joined a long procession of lost souls, each one spiraling into this eternal, oppressive darkness, trapped in a cycle from which there was no escape. The wedding, that event which had set everything in motion, had become nothing more than a fading, irrelevant memory. The laughter, the vows, the smiles, they were all buried beneath layers of shadow, now nothing more than a distant echo that would never again reach the surface. The hope that had once flickered within her, the fleeting dream of freedom, had been extinguished like a candle snuffed out by an unrelenting wind. She had once believed that her connection to those she loved could save her. But the truth was more insidious. The house had already claimed them all, just as it had claimed her. She could feel them, the others, their souls intertwined with hers, their voices whispering faintly in the recesses of her mind. They were lost, like her, caught in a web of despair that the house had spun long before her arrival. They had all hoped to escape, to find freedom, but now there was no difference between them and the walls they had once feared. They had all become one, swallowed whole by the house's insatiable hunger. The voices, once distinct, had become indistinguishable from each other. There was no more individuality, no more uniqueness. There was only the collective despair, a symphony of suffering that echoed through the endless corridors of this dark prison. And yet, even in the midst of this suffocating void, something strange began to stir within her. A part of Annabelle, however small, clung to the idea that there could be something more. She was not ready to accept the inevitability of her fate. The house had consumed her, yes, but it had not destroyed her entirely. There was still a piece of her that fought back, a small ember that refused to die. She felt it flickering, a stubborn little spark within her chest. Could this spark still grow? Could it break free from the chains that bound her, from the suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides? The house, sensing this resistance, seemed to react. The darkness grew deeper, more oppressive, as though the very walls themselves were closing in around her. It was a warning, an assertion of power, a declaration that no light, no hope could exist in this place. But Annabelle was no longer afraid. The terror that had once consumed her had been replaced by something far more powerful: defiance. The house had tried to break her, to force her into submission, but she refused to yield. She had learned its ways, its tricks, its manipulations, and she knew now that there was only one thing left to do. It was not escape. Escape was a lie, a false hope. The house had already shown her that. No, there was something more profound to be done. The only way to break the cycle, to end the torment, was not to flee, but to confront the house, to make it see that it had no dominion over her. She had become part of it, yes, but she could also break that bond, sever it, if only she could gather enough strength to do so. In the suffocating silence, she focused. She recalled the faces of those she loved, her family, her friends. And for the first time since entering the house, she allowed herself to truly feel the love she had once shared with them. It was a powerful force, a warmth that cut through the coldness of the house like a blade. She allowed that warmth to fill her, to push back against the darkness, to become her weapon. The house trembled. The walls seemed to shudder under the weight of her defiance. It was not just the house that felt her resistance. It was the spirits of those who had been trapped here long before her. They, too, had been consumed by the darkness, but now they saw what she had seen. They understood the truth, the possibility of release. And together, in that fleeting moment of unity, they fought back. It was not enough to escape, but it was enough to break the house's hold on them, to force it to acknowledge that it could not claim them completely. In the end, it was not a triumphant victory. The house did not fall, nor did the darkness dissipate. But Annabelle's fight had cracked it open, exposing its true nature. It was not a place, but a state of being, a manifestation of despair. And as the house recoiled from her defiance, she understood that it would never truly be gone. It would continue to feed on the lost, the broken, the desperate. But she had seen through its illusions, and that, in itself, was enough. With a final, quiet breath, Annabelle let go. She did not fight to escape. She did not try to flee from the darkness that had claimed her. Instead, she embraced the truth that she had already become part of it. And in that moment, as the house's grip loosened, she was finally free. Free from the fear, free from the illusion, free from the eternal cycle. The house would remain, as it always had, waiting for the next soul to wander into its grasp. But Annabelle's story, The story of those who had fought back would live on. And for the first time, she was at peace with that truth. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a part of something far greater than herself. Something eternal. Something that could not be consumed.